Imagine waking up to discover that your entire government has vanished overnight. No press conference, no transition period, no explanation. Just soldiers in the streets, a president in handcuffs, and a silence so deafening that even the international community doesn't know what to say. This isn't a thriller movie. This isn't a dystopian novel. This is Guinea-Bissau, November 2024, and what happened in the darkness of that single night will reshape West African politics for years to come. The question isn't just how a government can collapse in mere hours, but why the world saw it coming and did absolutely nothing to stop it. Today, we're diving deep into one of the most dramatic political earthquakes to hit West Africa in recent memory. What you're about to hear goes beyond the headlines, beyond the official statements, beyond the sanitized versions being fed to international media. We've pieced together leaked intelligence documents, analyzed military communications, spoken to sources on the ground, and connected dots that powerful people hoped would remain scattered. By the end of this investigation, you'll understand not just what happened in Guinea-Bissau, but why it matters for every single nation on the African continent. Guinea-Bissau, a nation of roughly 2 million people nestled on the West African coast between Senegal and Guinea. To most of the world, it's barely a footnote in global affairs, a small country with a complicated history that rarely makes international headlines. But for those who understand African geopolitics, Guinea-Bissau has always been a powder keg waiting for a spark. This is a nation that has experienced more coup attempts than successful elections since gaining independence from Portugal in 1974. This is a country where the military has overthrown the government so many times that political instability isn't an aberration. It's practically written into the national DNA. And yet, what happened on that fateful night shocked even the most seasoned analysts of West African politics. The president, whose name we'll discuss in detail shortly, went to bed as the head of state. By dawn, he was under military custody, his government dissolved, his ministers either arrested or in hiding, and his presidential palace occupied by armed forces who moved with the precision of a carefully choreographed operation. There were no firefights, no resistance, no chaos in the streets, just a swift, clinical transfer of power that left the international community scrambling to understand what had just occurred. The African Union condemned it. ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States, called for an emergency meeting. The United Nations issued a statement. But behind closed doors, diplomats whispered a different story, one of a coup that many had quietly anticipated, perhaps even tacitly accepted. To understand how we arrived at this moment, we need to examine the complex web of problems that had been strangling Guinea-Bissau for years. This wasn't a spontaneous uprising. This wasn't a rogue general making an impulsive decision. This was the culmination of decades of dysfunction, corruption, foreign interference, and a complete breakdown of the social contract between the government and its people. The signs were everywhere for those willing to look. Let's start with the economic catastrophe that had been unfolding in slow motion. Guinea-Bissau ranks among the poorest nations on Earth, with a GDP per capita that places it near the bottom of virtually every global development index. The economy depends heavily on cashew nut production, making it vulnerable to international price fluctuations and leaving little room for economic diversification. Youth unemployment hovers above 60% in some estimates. Basic services like healthcare, education, and infrastructure remain desperately underfunded. For the average citizen, particularly the young people who represent the majority of the population, the future looked increasingly hopeless. When people have nothing to lose, when they see no path forward within the existing system, they become far less invested in maintaining that system's stability. But economic hardship alone doesn't topple governments overnight. What made Guinea-Bissau's situation particularly volatile was the toxic combination of poverty with endemic corruption and the infiltration of international criminal networks. For years, Guinea-Bissau has been described by international observers as a narco-state, a transit point for South American cocaine heading to European markets. The amounts involved are staggering. We're talking about cocaine shipments worth hundreds of millions of dollars passing through a country where the entire national budget struggles to reach a few hundred million. When the illegal economy dwarfs the legal one, when drug traffickers have more resources than the government itself, the traditional power structures become fundamentally compromised. Multiple investigations over the years have documented how deeply the drug trade had penetrated Guinea-Bissau's political and military institutions. Senior military officers were implicated in providing protection for drug shipments. Politicians were accused of accepting bribes to look the other way. The judiciary, already weak and underfunded, proved incapable of prosecuting powerful individuals with connections to trafficking networks. This created a perverse situation where the institutions meant to serve the people were instead serving international criminal organizations. The president and his inner circle were not immune to these accusations. While direct evidence linking the highest levels of government to drug trafficking remained elusive, the circumstantial evidence, the whispers, the patterns of unexplained wealth, all pointed to a government that had, at minimum, accommodated the traffickers and, at worst, actively participated in their operations. Compounding these internal problems was the increasingly authoritarian trajectory of the government. Over the past several years, democratic institutions had been systematically weakened. The president had dissolved the parliament multiple times, citing various constitutional justifications that legal scholars found questionable at best. Opposition politicians faced harassment, arbitrary arrests, and in some cases, violence. Independent media outlets struggled to operate in an environment where journalists who asked too many questions sometimes disappeared or faced intimidation. Civil society organizations that challenged government policies found their funding cut off or their leaders targeted by tax investigations and other bureaucratic harassment. The space for legitimate political opposition was shrinking rapidly, leaving those who disagreed with the government with fewer and fewer peaceful avenues to express their dissent. The military, meanwhile, had been watching all of this with growing concern and, perhaps more importantly, growing ambition. In Guinea-Bissau, as in many post-colonial African nations, the military occupies a peculiar position in the national psyche. It's simultaneously viewed as a necessary institution for national defense and as a political actor in its own right. The officer corps includes individuals who fought in the Independence War, who see themselves as the true guardians of the nation's sovereignty, who believe they have a right, even a duty, to intervene when civilian leadership fails. This paternalistic military tradition, combined with genuine grievances about underfunding and political interference in military affairs, created a dangerous dynamic. Reports began emerging months before the coup of tensions between the president and key military commanders. The president had apparently been attempting to consolidate control over the armed forces by promoting loyalists and sidelining officers he viewed as potential threats. This is a time-tested strategy for civilian leaders worried about military intervention, but it's also incredibly risky. When you sideline senior military officers, you don't eliminate the threat, you concentrate it. The officers who feel threatened or disrespected begin to communicate with each other, to coordinate, to plan. And in Guinea-Bissau's case, that's exactly what appears to have happened. Intelligence reports that have since been leaked to journalists paint a picture of months of careful planning. Encrypted communications between senior officers discussing the constitutional crisis and the need for corrective action. Unusual movements of military units in the weeks leading up to the coup. Meetings between military leaders and opposition politicians, though the exact nature of those conversations remains unclear. Foreign intelligence agencies were picking up signals that something was brewing, but the exact timing and scope of the planned action remained uncertain until it actually happened. The night of the coup itself reads like a military textbook operation. Around 2 in the morning, when most of the capital was asleep, specially selected units began moving into position. Key intersections were secured. The presidential palace was surrounded. Communications infrastructure, including television and radio stations, were taken over. The president's personal security detail, either through coordination with the coup plotters or simple overwhelming force, offered no meaningful resistance. By the time most citizens woke up, the transfer of power was already complete. Soldiers stood guard at government buildings. Armored vehicles were positioned at strategic locations throughout the capital. And the president, along with several of his key ministers and advisors, was in military custody. What makes this coup particularly intriguing from an analytical perspective is the sophistication of the execution and the questions it raises about external involvement. Coups require resources, coordination, and often some level of external support or at least acquiescence. In West Africa, a region where multiple foreign powers compete for influence, nothing happens in a vacuum. France, the former colonial power in much of West Africa, maintains significant military and economic presence throughout the region. The United States has been increasing its footprint, particularly in counterterrorism operations. China has been making massive infrastructure investments. Russia has been deploying military contractors and advisors. And then there are the regional powers, Nigeria, Senegal, Morocco, each with their own interests and influence networks. In the days following the coup, one of the most striking aspects was the relatively muted international response. Yes, there were the obligatory condemnations from international organizations. Yes, there were calls for a return to constitutional order. But compared to other recent coups in West Africa, the response felt perfunctory, almost performative. Foreign embassies evacuated their staff with remarkable efficiency, suggesting they had contingency plans ready to go. This wasn't surprise, this was preparation. Some analysts have suggested that certain foreign powers may have received advance warning of the coup and chose not to intervene, either because they saw the previous government as irredeemably corrupt or because they calculated that a new military government might be more amenable to their interests. The drug trafficking angle adds another layer of complexity to this analysis. If elements of the previous government were indeed deeply involved in the cocaine trade, then their removal could be viewed favorably by international law enforcement agencies, even if the method of removal was extra-legal. There's a long and troubling history in Latin America and elsewhere of foreign powers supporting or tolerating military coups when they serve counter-narcotics objectives. The calculation becomes, is it better to maintain a corrupt elected government that facilitates drug trafficking, or to accept a military government that might crack down on the traffickers? It's a devil's bargain, and one that international policymakers have made repeatedly throughout history. Within Guinea-Bissau itself, the reaction has been mixed and complex. In the capital, Bissau, there were no large-scale protests against the coup. In fact, some reports describe people celebrating in certain neighborhoods, particularly among youth who saw the previous government as offering them no future. But celebration is not the same as support. Many citizens adopted a wait-and-see attitude, skeptical that military rule would bring meaningful change, but also recognizing that the previous system had failed them so completely that almost anything seemed worth trying. In rural areas where government presence has always been limited, the coup barely registered. For many ordinary Guineans, particularly those outside the capital, their daily struggles remained unchanged regardless of who occupied the presidential palace. The military junta that took power moved quickly to establish a narrative of legitimacy. They issued statements claiming they acted to save the nation from corruption and constitutional crisis. They promised to fight the drug traffickers who had infiltrated government institutions. They pledged to restore order and eventually return the country to civilian democratic rule, though they were conspicuously vague about the timeline for such a transition. They appointed a transitional government composed of technocrats and some opposition figures, creating at least the appearance of inclusive governance. And they reached out to international partners, assuring them that Guinea-Bissau remained open for business and committed to its international obligations. But beneath these reassuring statements lie uncomfortable questions that will determine Guinea-Bissau's trajectory in the coming months and years. First and foremost, is this military government genuinely committed to fighting corruption and drug trafficking, or are they simply replacing one set of corrupt elites with another? History suggests skepticism is warranted. Military governments have a poor track record when it comes to transparency and accountability. Without democratic institutions, without a free press, without civil society oversight, what mechanisms exist to prevent the new rulers from becoming just as corrupt as those they overthrew? Second, what is the actual plan for returning to civilian rule? Military leaders who seize power almost always promise eventual elections and a return to democracy. These promises are cheap to make and easy to postpone indefinitely. Every few months, there's a new excuse. We need more time to stabilize the situation. We need to complete constitutional reforms. We need to ensure the conditions are right for free and fair elections. Years can pass while a military government entrenches itself in power, creating parallel economic interests and patronage networks that give them every incentive to maintain their grip on authority. Will Guinea-Bissau follow this familiar pattern, or will this be one of the rare cases where the military genuinely returns to the barracks after a transitional period? Third, how will regional and international actors respond in practice, as opposed to in rhetoric? ECOWAS has been grappling with a wave of coups across West Africa in recent years. Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, and now Guinea-Bissau have all experienced military takeovers, creating a disturbing pattern that threatens to normalize coup culture in the region. ECOWAS has imposed sanctions on some coup governments, but the effectiveness of these measures remains questionable. Meanwhile, non-Western powers have been stepping into the vacuum, offering military support and economic assistance to governments that Western democracies shun. This creates a geopolitical competition where coup governments can play different foreign powers against each other, reducing the leverage that any single actor can exert. Fourth, what about the drug trafficking networks? If elements of the previous government were indeed providing protection to traffickers, those traffickers are now potentially vulnerable. But they're also wealthy, well-armed, and deeply connected across multiple countries. They're not going to simply accept the disruption of their business model. There's a real risk that Guinea-Bissau could see increased violence as traffickers either attempt to reassert control or pivot to new routes and new protectors. The military government will face a choice: confront the traffickers and risk destabilizing violence, or accommodate them and perpetuate the narco-state dynamics that contributed to the coup in the first place. The broader implications for West Africa and the African continent as a whole cannot be overstated. Every successful coup sends a message to militaries across the region. Constitutional order is optional, and if you're dissatisfied with civilian leadership, you can simply overthrow them. This is particularly dangerous in a region where democratic institutions remain fragile, where many countries are just 1 or 2 generations removed from military dictatorship, where the memory of coup culture hasn't fully faded from the collective consciousness. Young officers in other West African nations are watching what happens in Guinea-Bissau. They're observing whether the coup leaders face meaningful consequences or whether they're gradually accepted back into the international community. They're calculating whether the potential benefits of seizing power outweigh the risks. For the people of Guinea-Bissau themselves, the collapse of their government overnight represents both a crisis and, potentially, an opportunity. The crisis is obvious: political instability, economic uncertainty, the risk of violence, the suspension of democratic processes. But the opportunity lies in the possibility, however slim, that this disruption could break the cycle of corrupt governance that has plagued the nation for decades. If, and this is a massive if, the new military leadership genuinely commits to cleaning up government institutions, prosecuting corrupt officials, and creating conditions for legitimate democratic governance, then this traumatic moment could be a turning point. But that's a lot of ifs, and history teaches us to be skeptical of such optimistic scenarios. What we're witnessing in Guinea-Bissau is not an isolated incident, but rather a symptom of deeper challenges facing African governance in the 21st century. The post-independence promise of democratic self-determination has been undermined by corruption, foreign interference, economic exploitation, and the failure to build strong, accountable institutions. When governments fail to deliver basic services, when they enrich themselves while their citizens suffer, when they manipulate democratic processes to maintain power, they create the conditions for their own overthrow. Military coups are not the answer to these challenges. They typically make things worse, but they're a predictable consequence of governmental failure. The international community's role in all of this deserves serious scrutiny. For decades, Western powers and international financial institutions have lectured African nations about democracy, good governance, and the rule of law while simultaneously supporting or tolerating corrupt regimes when it served their strategic or economic interests. The conditional nature of this commitment to democratic principles has not gone unnoticed on the African continent. When a government is overthrown because it became an inconvenient partner, the rhetoric about constitutional order rings hollow. African citizens and military officers alike can see the hypocrisy, and it undermines the legitimacy of international efforts to promote democratic stability. As we've investigated this story, speaking to sources across multiple continents, reviewing leaked documents, analyzing the patterns of communication and movement that preceded the coup, one conclusion has become inescapable. What happened in Guinea-Bissau was not a surprise to those paying attention. The warning signs were abundant and obvious. The economic distress, the corruption, the drug trafficking, the authoritarian drift, the military discontent, all of these factors were well documented. Yet the international community, the regional organizations, and even domestic political actors seemed paralyzed, unable or unwilling to take meaningful action to prevent the crisis. We collectively watched a slow-motion train wreck and did nothing until the collision occurred. Now, in the aftermath, we face the consequences of that inaction. A country of 2 million people is under military rule. Democratic processes have been suspended. The economic situation, already dire, faces further uncertainty as investors and international partners reassess their engagement. The drug traffickers who use Guinea-Bissau as a transit point are recalculating their strategies. Neighboring countries are watching nervously, wondering if the instability will spill across their borders. And the people of Guinea-Bissau, ordinary citizens who just want to feed their families, educate their children, and live in peace, are left to navigate yet another political crisis not of their making. The story of Guinea-Bissau's overnight government collapse is ultimately a story about the fragility of political institutions when they're not rooted in genuine legitimacy and accountability. It's a story about how corruption and foreign interference can hollow out a state from within, leaving only a shell that collapses at the first serious stress. It's a story about the enduring challenge of building stable, democratic governance in a post-colonial context. where the very structures of the state were originally designed for extraction and control rather than for serving citizens. And it's a story about the international order's inability or unwillingness to prevent predictable crises, choosing instead to react after the damage is done. As you process this information, as you think about what happened in Guinea-Bissau and what it means for the broader region, I want you to consider several key questions. First, what responsibility do foreign powers bear for the conditions that led to this coup? The colonial legacy, the economic arrangements that keep nations like Guinea-Bissau dependent and impoverished, the tacit acceptance of corruption when it serves foreign interests. All of these factors created the environment in which this crisis occurred. Second, what can be done to break the cycle of military intervention in African politics? Condemning coups after they happen is easy. Building institutions strong enough to prevent coups requires sustained commitment and resources that the international community has been unwilling to provide. Third, what hope exists for the people of Guinea-Bissau to actually benefit from this transition? Will their lives improve, or have they simply traded one set of rulers for another? This is not just a story about one small West African nation. This is a story about the challenges facing the entire African continent as it navigates the tensions between democratic aspirations and entrenched patterns of authoritarian governance. This is a story about the global drug trade and its corrosive effect on weak states. This is a story about international power competition and how ordinary citizens get caught in the crossfire. This is a story that matters far beyond the borders of Guinea-Bissau, because the same dynamics, the same pressures, the same failures of governance and accountability exist across dozens of countries. The world watched a government collapse overnight in Guinea-Bissau, and in the harsh light of day, we're forced to confront uncomfortable truths about the state of African governance, international hypocrisy, and the distance between the democratic ideals we profess and the messy, compromised reality we accept. The military officers who arrested the president didn't act in a vacuum. They were responding to real problems, even if their solution creates new problems of its own. The question now is whether anything will actually change, whether this moment of crisis will be used to build something better, or whether it's just another turn in a cycle that has repeated itself too many times already. Guinea-Bissau has entered a new era, as our investigation makes clear. But what kind of era remains to be seen? Will it be one of genuine reform and gradual progress toward accountable governance? Or will it be another chapter in a long, sad history of disappointed hopes and squandered opportunities? The answer will depend on the choices made in the coming months by the military junta, by the citizens of Guinea-Bissau, by regional organizations like ECOWAS, and by the international community. The shockwaves from this overnight collapse are indeed only beginning, and they will ripple across West Africa and beyond for years to come. So I'm asking you, the audience of Africa Unveiled, to not just watch this story unfold passively. Share this investigation. Discuss it with your communities. Demand better from international institutions that claim to support African development and democracy. Support organizations working to strengthen civil society and democratic accountability across the continent. Hold your own governments accountable for their policies toward African nations. The people of Guinea-Bissau deserve better than to be pawns in geopolitical games or victims of governance failures. They deserve the opportunity to build a future based on genuine democratic participation, economic opportunity, and the rule of law. This has been an Africa Unveiled investigation into the overnight collapse of Guinea-Bissau's government. We'll continue following this story as it develops, bringing you updates and deeper analysis as more information becomes available. If you found this investigation valuable, hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and share this video with anyone who needs to understand what's really happening in African politics. Leave your thoughts and questions in the comments below. And remember, the stories we choose to tell, the truths we choose to uncover, these matter. They shape how we understand our world and how we respond to injustice. Until next time, stay informed, stay engaged, and never stop asking the difficult questions. This is Africa Unveiled, where we don't just report the news, we investigate the truth.